there, it's Silver. This is Fate Samurai Remnant. So I'm actually a fan of Fate in general, so I was excited for this, but this is an action RPG, and it's using kind of like an evolved version of the Musou combat system. So think like Dynasty Warriors, Samurai Warriors, that sort of idea, but it's got a lot of extra layers added onto it, and it's very, very flashy this time around. So if you don't know anything about Fate, just as a really quick, like non-spoilery primer, it's basically a series where there are these secret wars that happen throughout history involving a few people, usually 7 or so, who are all fighting to use this wish-granting artifact. The artifact itself is actually what creates the war and the sort of rules for battle and everything, and the last person standing gets their wish granted, or at least that's the idea. Usually it's some variant form of the Holy Grail, but in this case it's called the Waxing Moon Ritual. And the idea is that the ritual will choose 7 masters, 7 people from around the area that the ritual takes place in, and they'll be marked with a sort of red tattoo thing, and they will summon a servant who is a heroic spirit, a sort of being from either real history or a mythological hero or monster or something like that. They can be all kinds of different things, anything from like Zeus to Alexander the Great. And it's a big point as to if you know what the true name of a servant actually is, because they don't reveal it lightly, because of course if everyone knows who they are, then the weaknesses they had in their legend or in history could actually be exploited to defeat them. And the idea is that the masters are usually okay fighters, like they can defend themselves, but the servants are drastically more powerful than their human masters, and it's really the servant's job to actually defend them and fight on their behalf until they're the last one standing, so that the master can get their wish granted. And in this case, your main character was chosen as a master for seemingly no reason, and is okay with the sword, but, is not really like a legend or anything in their own right. But they are able to summon a servant on accident, and the story takes place between you, your servant, trying to figure out who they are. They are a saber class, and just trying to figure out the truth behind this ritual and what all is happening. Oh yeah, I should mention the classes. There are like several, usually around 7, it kind of varies, different classes that a servant can be summoned into, and these classes sort of determine what permutation of that person's legend is going to be taking place. So like a saber class is going to be a master swordsman, so they are someone who had some sort of incredible swordsmanship skills in life or in their legend, whereas say a rider class is someone who is really good at riding a horse or a chariot or any number of things. And these classes are useful because the masters will refer to their servants by their class in public so that no one hears them use their name. So mechanically, the combat system is definitely the star of the show here, as you would probably expect for an action RPG, and it uses, like I mentioned, a sort of Dynasty Warriors-esque combat, but it's been like heavily upgraded and is focused on these action RPG mechanics that are really cool. So you've got the usual alternation between light and heavy attacks on the X and Y buttons, and just like the Warriors games, you have like, light, heavy, light, light, heavy, they're all their own combo, and every character that you can play actually has quite a long list of combos that they can use, but you don't only use your swords, you've got a couple of other things. So first off, you've got 4 different stances that you can switch between, and these are really cool because they all have their own completely different list of combos, so this means you have a lot of combat variety just while playing the main character. There's a lot that you can do. You only start with 2 of the stances, the earth and water stances, but eventually, through progressing the game, you'll get access to the wind and fire stances as well. The Earth stance is mostly geared towards facing singular opponents. It's sort of a mid-speed single katana stance that has the ability to sort of deflect attacks for a while. It's got like a separate, kind of like a guard gauge. There's no guarding in this game. You can't block, but it has its own sort of way to block by filling up this gauge, and it's pretty powerful against single enemies. The water stance is a dual katana stance that is mostly good for large crowds, especially of human enemies. It has very wide-reaching attacks, a lot of circular attacks and big cones and stuff like that, so it sweeps through the battlefield very quickly. It's also just super fast in general. The wind stance, which is actually my favorite, is a spell sword stance. That's mostly meant for monster slaying, although you can use it on anything. It's just most effective there. You have a single katana in one hand and a sort of green flame in the other, and it has its own magic gauge that you build up by using the normal attacks, and the heavy attacks expend this magic gauge to do some sort of large, like wide area flaming attacks and things like that. It's just really good against the monster type enemies, and it's just really fun to use in general. And then you've also got the fire stance, which is the last one you get, which is another dual katana stance, but it is really slow and has really hard-hitting attacks. Lots of like big skyward thrusts that send enemies flying and big downward slams and stuff like that. It's a really fun stance to use, and it actually gets faster and more powerful the less health you have. So it's sort of like a desperation stance. You've also got some magecraft that you can mix into it, and just like in a lot of the shows that Fates has, you need gems to actually cast spells. You'll get gems just from killing enemies, but you'll eventually also be able to buy them from a certain shop, which I'll get onto later, and also you'll get the ability to make them at your own magecraft workshop, which is your house. You'll start with just a basic fireball spell that is deceptively useful despite being a basic fireball. It sort of gathers enemies and sends them forward and then explodes a little bit later. It's good for like interrupting stronger attacks and things like that. But throughout your skill tree, you can also find all sorts of other spells you can get, from healing spells to buffs to your crit chance or buffs to your attack to larger like walls of fireballs and some other fancier stuff too. So there's a good variety of different spells, and you can have 4 of them equipped at any time. You'll also notice this sort of orangey yellowish gauge underneath your health gauge, and that is kind of like an ultimate. Basically, it just builds up by doing damage, and once it is full, you can use it to unleash a sort of huge finisher attack of some kind, depending on the stance you're in. And the servants also have this gauge, but for them, it's a noble phantasm gauge. So how do I explain? A noble phantasm is basically like the thing that makes their legend what it is. So like, for instance, King Arthur's is Excalibur. It is whatever about their legend it is that sort of is unique to them. And the other mechanics are based on your servant. So you have, of course, your servant Saber with you at all times, pretty much, and she just has some basic fighting AI. She's actually pretty effective and will fight alongside you. You have this affinity gauge, which is that sort of big circle with the smaller flames around it, and it builds up by doing damage and performing combos and all that stuff. And every time it fills up, it lights one of those flames, and you can use affinity techniques, which are sort of big, flashy attacks that your servant can do for you just by consuming different amounts of these flames. So every servant has several different affinity techniques they can do. They're really strong usually. And your Saber, because she's with you throughout the story, she also learns extra ones and you can switch them out. She learns more than you can have equipped at a time. Every servant can have 4 equipped. And you'll also see that each servant has a sort of vertical gauge to the left of their portrait, and this is what actually allows you to play as them temporarily, which is super cool. So once this is completely full, you can switch out and play as them for a while. It's almost like a Devil Trigger kind of idea, basically, because it's like a super-powered form that drains slowly while it's active. It's basically the same concept, but yeah, you switch to controlling that servant directly, and you can use all their combos and also use all their affinity techniques and things at the same time. Now, one major difference in this particular conflict as opposed to the normal like Holy Grail based ones is the 7 masters and the 7 servants aren't the only ones. There also seem to be 8 rogue servants that have been summoned that don't have any masters, and these you can actually find throughout main quests and side quests, and eventually you can actually befriend them and take them with you, so you can have them in battle with you as well. They all have, they share the affinity gauge that you're using for your other servants, so you can just switch between the two which techniques you want to use. And they also each have their own gauge that allows you to substitute out and play as them, so you can play as all the rogue servants as well, and they are all just as powerful. And there will even be some quests where you will specifically play as someone else, even one of your enemy servants and stuff. So it gives you a really good variety of combat in this game for sure. Not only do you just have really good variety in general and normally, but it also allows you to play as other characters and stuff that you might not expect to give you a dose of something else. The game also has several very expansive skill trees. You have one for your main character that's very large, and it has 5 different sections, one in the middle, as well as one for each of the stances as you unlock them. And the skill points are just gained from normal combat and stuff, as well as from using these different types of skill jewels that give you different numbers of points, depending on what the type of jewel you're using. You can use them on anyone. And yeah, just going through the skill tree will up your basic stats, give you new spells, give you new techniques, and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's very much worth going through. These are the exciting version of skill trees, right? You don't see like 5% crit chance or anything like that. They're all really cool upgrades that are worth getting. And each servant also has their own skill tree. Saber has her own that expands as you go through the story and increase your sort of bond with her. It'll unlock more branches of it. And each rogue servant also has a smaller skill tree dedicated to just them. But one thing you'll notice is that the servants' skills cost a lot more skill points than the ones for you, so you're going to build their trees a little bit more slowly, and they're probably what you're going to want to save those skill jewels for most of the time. The overall structure of the game is pretty interesting. You have free reign of this huge city called Edo, and there are a lot of different districts that you can go to. Each district can be wandered around in like a pseudo-open world kind of idea. They all have different fights to do and various treasures and stuff. They also have all kinds of different tasks to do, like kill a certain number of these specific enemies or find these specific drops and things like that. They'll give you like skill jewels and money and stuff as a reward for completing all those. And as you go, you'll find these things called digressions, which are side quests. And digressions are things you want to do as soon as you can, because if you progress too far in the main quest line, they'll become unavailable. So they are sort of time limited. You do need to do them while they're there. They won't stay there forever. And they tend to have really good rewards, and sometimes even allowing you to meet new servants and stuff. So they're definitely worth looking into whenever you find a new one. The main quests take you all over the city and all sorts of different things, from huge fights against monsters to boss fights against other servants to sort of investigatory quests trying to find out who the other masters are and all sorts of things like that. There's a lot of variety in terms of the main quest, and it's very long as well. I'm pretty sure this is like roughly a 50-hour game if you want to actually go through it in a relatively complete way, but if you're going for like a full completionist run, it's going to run you even more than that. But in addition to all the other various kinds of main quests, there's also one specifically that completely changes up the gameplay called a spirit font conflict. Basically, you connect to the ley lines around the city, and you can actually see a web of these ley lines as they're all connected to each other, and it has like a strategy game kind of layer where you have a certain objective. You got to reach a specific part of the city, and you have a specific number of turns to get there, and you've got to go from one ley line to the next and cross them, taking these spirit fonts as you go and turning them blue, and there'll be red ones and yellow ones depending on the other kinds of enemies that are there, and you want to cut them off so that you can sort of cut off their supply of magic and get rid of them. You can also directly encounter enemies as they're exploring around the strategy map, and it will take you to a real-time combat section where you got to beat them to get that ley line on your side. And there are some other tools you have. You can summon rogue servants that you have on your list of allies in order to have them be like NPCs. You can also direct them if you want to, but by default they'll be like NPCs that wander around and sort of help you take these fonts, giving you the ability to go to multiple places at once. You can also use these things called mystic codes, which are sort of like magical artifacts in the Fate universe that give you the ability to teleport between different places you've already been, or give you extra actions per turn and stuff like that. So there's actually a lot to it. It does not feel like an afterthought at all. It feels like a fully fledged sort of separate game mode that you sometimes have to do in order to progress in the story. It's pretty neat. I didn't expect it, and I was happy to see it continue to get fleshed out and more complex, and the extra mechanics get added to it and stuff as the game goes on. So basically what all this means is this game has a stellar amount of gameplay variety. For an action RPG, there's a lot that you're going to be doing, from gathering servants to doing these spirit font conflicts to progressing the main quest and doing all the various digressions, which often have all sorts of other mechanics involved in them that are a little bit different and may involve you playing as an entirely different character for a while. It's a big game, and it's got a lot going for it. It's a really solid action RPG that has a lot of intertwining mechanics that make it very complex to play, relatively challenging as well, and just a lot of fun in general. Story-wise, without spoiling anything, there's a lot of good reveals. Of course, you start to learn who all the masters are and who all the servants are, what their true names are and what they can do, and the various plans of each of them. It is a very Fate-like story. So if you've ever watched or played one of the like original Fate games, then you will be right at home in terms of how the overall story feels and the motivations of the characters and the various bits of intrigue you're going to be finding and all that stuff. It is definitely very Fate-like. And although it definitely does have those flashes of some really dark parts, it doesn't quite get as like excessively dark as some of the other pieces of the Fate franchise. You know, a couple of the anime and things do get really dark. This doesn't quite reach that point. It is a little bit more funny in a lot of ways. It's still serious, but it's not quite like that. So if you're a fan of Fate in general, then I would say definitely check this out. It's a really good adaptation of a fun story, and if you're not a fan of Fate or you don't know anything about Fate, but you do like action RPGs, then this is probably a safe bet as well, because it's got such a large amount of gameplay variety that you probably don't need to be invested in the universe of this series to still have a really good time. I'm definitely excited to see what the DLCs are going to bring. Hopefully we're talking like expansion level content with new servants and stuff, but I really don't know. I'm definitely interested though, so I'll probably be covering those as well next year when they start to come out. But thank you guys very much for watching. I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Fate Samurai Remnant, and I'll see you guys next time.